Welcome to Shreyas the Secret School. I'm Shreyas Harish, and this is English Grade 1, an introduction to the alphabet. In this video, I'm going to cover what the alphabet is and why we have an alphabet. I'm also going to take a detour and get into why and how language ended up forming the way it did, as well as importantly, how we therefore ended up with the kind of alphabet that we do have today. In fact, I'm really just going to take this detour because that seems more fun, and we'll end up covering why the alphabet is the way it is and what an alphabet is along the process. To begin with, there are a few questions which are top of mind as we get into this topic. At a broad level, what is the history of language? More specifically, have human beings always had language? Probably not, right? So when and where did language come from? Why are there so many languages, even in relatively small areas? How come we have so many different languages? What is the process through which this begins to happen? Why did we start writing and when did we start writing? Was there someone specific who came up with this idea and all of us were just like, this is great, let's do it? And finally, how did we end up with alphabets for so many different languages? Not all languages have alphabets, but most of them do. How come? Let's try to start answering these questions with the dawn of language. Let's start off with what we definitely know, probably. All right, so there was the start of the universe. We didn't have any languages at that point of time, right? Then we had the formation of the earth, still probably no languages around. Then we've got the beginning of life on earth. Now that started off with some sort of microbial life. We probably didn't have language at that stage either. And then a whole bunch of evolution happened, and we started to have more complex beings like animals. At that stage, animals probably communicated. And I mean, at least right now, they do communicate. But that's not quite the same thing as language. So let's skip ahead to the point where human beings came along. Uh, I would assume that humans also, to begin with, probably communicate in some shape or form, but didn't yet have a formalized language. So if we keep moving forward a little bit, at some stage, some human beings, somehow or the other, come up with language. Now, this answer is so far not very useful at all, but it raises the important question of what really is the difference between communication and language. So communication is a superset and language is a type of communication or a subset of communication. Communication just means getting an idea across from one person to another or a few people. You can use gestures, you can use text, you can just give someone a death stare, you can get the basic idea across. Language, on the other hand, has slightly more nuanced rules in terms of what words are allowed, what words are understood, and what they mean. Rules about how you put these words together and how you can't put the words together in order to convey your meaning. Now that we have a rough idea of what language is, when did language start? Spoiler alert, we don't have the answer to that. But we have different sources which say fairly different things. The reason there's so much confusion about this is historians try to figure these things out by digging up artifacts which show some sort of conclusive proof that humans were using language. If it's written, it's a little bit easier to find. But spoken language, you got to look for bone structures or things that show that human beings were making certain kinds of noises, which is really tough to get into. Now, we have some sources which say that about 70,000 years back, we had the basic ingredients for language, which is that human beings were making certain kinds of sounds to indicate things here and there. But only 20,000 years back did we have the first kind of language of any sort. And even those don't match the definition of languages that we have today, which came up some time after that. Then again, other sources say entirely different things. Like we probably had some type of language or the other, or fundamentals of language 2.5 million years back. Others say that maybe 300,000 years back, we started talking properly, indicating some sort of ideas or actions. But what most of these sources pretty much agree on is that about 5,000 years back is when we probably had our first writing system of any kind. Next, let's try to understand a little bit more about the English language, or really where the English language fits in amongst all of the different languages. But before we get there, let's just pause for a second and think about how many languages are there? No, really, pause. Give it a shot. There are apparently about close to 7,000 languages, and that's just the languages which exist today. Apparently, there have been close to about 31,000 languages across the history of time. And of course, this is just an estimate, if Google's AI is to be believed. Now, what's super interesting about this huge number of languages is that it's not very uniformly spread across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. This doesn't correlate very well with area or population. It's not like for every 1,000 or 10,000 people, we come up with a language. And this is most visible in the Pacific region, where you got way more languages per person than you have in any other part of the world. And this has something to do with the way in which languages travel from one place to another. To understand how languages evolve and move, let's start off by looking at how one word evolves and moves around. If you take the word chai or tea, half the world seems to call it chai while the other half calls it tea. Well, each part of the world uses some variant which sounds pretty similar to one of these or is pretty clearly derived from one of these. It would look as if at some stage someone decided to just change up the name a little bit. And then, as news about this drink started to spread, people picked up one variant or the other of the name and kept making minor modifications to one of these two. You can see this sort of movement a little bit more gradually with a word like water, where the specific word which is used is a little bit different in each pocket of geography. But very clearly, language has a geographic aspect to it, where as you step a little further out, there are more opportunities to marginally modify the word which is used to refer to a certain object or idea. And modifications tend to happen over the course of time. And so you keep drifting a little further apart with each step until you end up with a few entirely different languages. Essentially, the creation of language is like a massive scale game of Chinese whisper. Now, there is a Reddit thread linked below with the QR code at the bottom of the screen, which does a much better job of explaining how exactly languages evolve and shape over the course of time and geography. Now that we know that languages evolve from each other, you might wonder when each language actually emerged. Well, this Wikipedia link has a list of very many languages and their estimated ages, although we don't know for sure in many cases. And I've also tried to just depict a few different languages which I've picked up, which I can kind of sort of relate to or just know of at least, and plotted them on a timeline to just see when languages emerged in different parts of the world or which languages emerged in different parts of the world at different points of time. But a timeline view doesn't really do justice to this. There is this really cool image from The Guardian, which shows in a tree-like fashion which languages evolved from which languages, and also shows how many people are really speaking each of these languages or which ones came to finally dominate over a period of time. What we've seen so far has largely to do with the evolution of spoken language, but the idea of writing itself evolved at some point of time. In fact, we know that the idea of writing has evolved at least four different times entirely independent of each other. It came up first in Uruk, or modern day Iraq. It also came up in Egypt. The Chinese also came up with the idea of writing a little bit later, and they did the same thing in Mesoamerica, which is parts of Northern and Central America. Now, the Indus Valley also had some type of written script, but we don't know whether they came up with it entirely independently or if it was inspired by the idea of writing that they saw somewhere else as well. There are two stories about the origin of writing, which are pretty interesting and give us a rough idea of how writing came to be. Both of these are set in Uruk. The first one is set 10,000 years back, which is, mind you, 5,000 years before we had a full-blown form of writing. The people of Uruk, they had trouble keeping track of their cattle and commodities and crops, or at least who owned how much of this, that, which might have been in some sort of common reserve. So they came up with the idea of tokens, where each token has maybe a symbol of each commodity or crop drawn on it, and they represent a certain quantity of the given commodity or resource. I like to think of this as sort of like ancient Catan resource cards. Now, this isn't a full blown form of writing, it's just a kind of starting point of representation. In the second story, which derives from a very old poem which might or might not translate too very well. In this story, a rich dude wants to send a message to somewhere else. And so he goes to a messenger to carry the message by word of mouth. But for some reason, the messenger is not able to rally the message by word of mouth because his mouth is heavy or something of that sort that I did not completely understand. So he decides that he's going to write down the message on a clay tablet, but we don't have a way of writing it. So he draws out the message using different types of symbols. And this is apparently the first time that someone has written something down, and that slowly evolved into a type of written language. This sort of a symbol-based form of writing, while very useful, is still super complicated. And some languages do have this sort of a symbol-based alphabet even today. But around 4,000 years back, the people of the Sinai Peninsula decided that this was a little too complicated, and they started converting some of the hieroglyphics which they already had to mean a specific sound, possibly the sound of the word that it represented, or the starting sound of the word that it represented. And that slowly transformed into the first alphabet of any kind. And this image here shows how, from the first few alphabets, small changes were made to better suit different languages. Because, as we know, languages are also constantly evolving as they move around here and there. And that is what gradually formed the English alphabet that we know of today. Now, an alphabet is a little bit more than just a series of symbols which you write and have some meaning. In fact, there are at least a few design choices which go into creating an alphabet. The first is what sounds you are going to actually cover in the alphabet. Not all languages have all sounds, and they each have slightly different sets of sounds. So you want to cover the sounds of your language, of course. Second, you would want to figure out what symbols you want to represent each sound, or in some cases, combinations of sounds. You'd want to figure out what direction you're going to write your script in. Is it going to be left to right to left? You can even go wild and go top to bottom, bottom to top, go in a spiral, anything that's interesting for you. You'd also want to figure out how you're going to combine letters to form larger words or to form more complex sounds in certain cases. And finally, maybe less importantly, but still very useful to learn the alphabet, is what order the alphabet goes in. So, what have we learned from this very long winded detour of mine? Well, we know that human beings have been communicating for a very long time. They must have been, because life is pretty difficult without it. This communication led to talking, and as we got better at talking or started doing it in the same way more often, that would have formed languages. And a few languages would have formed more languages as it kept evolving over time and geography. At some stage, we realized that we need to start accounting for things, and so we started scribbling things down, which then led to writing. And as this writing started to better fit the languages that we were also creating, we got better and better at this process of writing. And then we started writing so well that we've got something written down, or an alphabet and a form of writing for most all languages. And that is where we're at today. Now, if none of this is a convincing reason for you to learn the alphabet or for you to understand why it's so fundamentally important, keep in mind that nothing that I've written on these slides can be read without understanding the English alphabet and how to read it. It fundamentally helps us with communicating, which is just a pretty basic human need. And so the alphabet is kind of our starting point for anything that we would want to learn over the course of all of the future videos. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button to see more videos just like this one. You could also share the video to spread the idea of open source learning. And it'll be great if you subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this in this series and many others. Thank you for watching.